feast before my enemies, the first thing we see is this reminder and this promise of a God who will feed me in spite of my enemies. A God who will feed me in spite of my enemies, in spite of the opposition, in spite of the adversity. And that's what we see in this. In fact, it's interesting. When in Hebrew, there's about 5 different translations for the word enemies. In terms of translating it into English. But the one that's actually used here by David is a Hebrew word which literally means those who besiege me. Those who besiege me. And so you got to understand a little something about David and kind of why he would maybe kind of use that phrasing within this passage is because David was a military strategist. He was a warrior. He was a fighter. And so David, he understood a little something about how you would invade a city, how you would take a city, especially if that city was fortified, especially if it had walls, if it had defenses, is that the way you would take over a city, you'd gain control of a city, is you would besiege it. And then what's meant by besieging is literally means you would surround it, you would cut it off from all of its resources. Because you got to understand is back then is that oftentimes their resources, when it came to their water, a city's water or a city's food supply, their corn, their cattle, their beef, it was all outside the walls. And so if you wanted to take over a fortified city, what you would do is you would surround them, you would cut off their resources. And so here you have David going, listen. And I think reminding us of the importance of listen, as long as your focus, as long as your faith is in your resources, is in what's out there. Listen, what you do is you set yourself up for a situation where it can regularly be cut off. See, what he's getting at is so often, and the problem for so many of us is we tend to put our confidence. The reason so many of us, we fail to experience the feast, we fail to experience abundance, we fail to have that perspective like Paul had, like David had, to walk in joy, walk in victory, is we put our faith, we put our confidence not in a relationship, not in the relationship we have with Jesus, not on the inside. It's that we put our faith and our confidence in the resources outside. And again, as long as your confidence is out there, it can always be cut off. The enemy will love when he wants to steal your joy and steal your victory and steal your freedom. That's where he starts. He starts to cut off some of those resources. And listen, if your confidence is in your job, you got to know you can lose it. If your confidence is in the marriage, you can lose it. If your confidence is in your health, you can lose it. And yet what David's trying to get us to see is that, hey, look, that's why it's so important. You got to put your confidence in the one thing that can't ever be taken away from you. That relationship with Jesus. See, that what was driving the joy, what was driving the confidence, what was not faith in what's out there, but in the relationship with Jesus in here. That's where he found the strength. That's where he found the confidence. And can I tell you, for some of us, the reason why your life doesn't feel like a joy ride, but feels a little more like an emotional roller coaster a lot of times, is because you've put your faith and confidence in everything out there. You've put your faith and confidence in this pursuit of happiness. In fact, literally, happiness literally means happenstance. It's all external. It's all what's going on around you, things that you can't control. And yet, if you want to experience joy, you want to experience that confidence to get through it, listen, you've got to put your faith not in what's out there, but in that relationship with Jesus in here, in a source that can't be stolen, a source that can't be quenched, a source that can't run dry. It's amazing to me. So oftentimes and the enemy loves to take this tactic of trying to get us to focus on what we need most is out there in a relationship, in a job, and all this other stuff that's oftentimes so often beyond our control. And we get so caught up in there, and it's amazing, especially when adversity comes, when hardship comes. I'm amazed how many people sit there and say, "Well, I'd love to come to church. I'd love to, show up, but I've got all this stuff going on in my life." And rather than seeing the feast, rather than showing up to church, rather than showing up to a place where He's prepared the table, where you can get fed and you can get filled and renewed in your relationship with Jesus, this feast He sets before us, we get caught up and think, I can't do this right now. I got too much adversity. I got too much trial. And the enemy would love to get you to surrender, love to get you to give up by, again, putting your focus and allowing what's happening around there to drive you and to get you to lose sight of what you have in here. That relationship with Jesus. So the first thing, again, God will feed me in spite of my enemies. But get this, is that also God feeds me because of my enemies as well. God feeds me because of my enemies as well. I love, David had a little bit of Paul in him. It was almost like David was like, hey, go ahead, surround me. Go ahead, besiege me. I've got a source. I've got something on the inside that no matter what you take, no matter what you steal, no matter how much trouble you try to surround me with or come against me, hey, listen, I've got a source that will never run dry. I've got a shepherd who is always going to lead me, who's always going to guide me, who's always going to provide for me. And so I love this. And again, kind of reminds us, he says, you prepare for me a table before my enemies. He's also saying, listen, God feeds me even because of my enemies. I remember when I was going to the University of Oklahoma, I would oftentimes on the weekend, I would come home from college so I could get a good meal at my house. My mom would oftentimes, she'd just cook up. I'd show up on the weekend. She'd cook up these amazing dishes. And oftentimes, too, I would come home, and not just to get a good meal, but and something different than the ramen noodles I was living on for most of the week, but also so I could reconnect with some friends. And so typically, when I showed up to dinner or show up at the house, it wasn't typically just me. It was me and several unexpected friends and unexpected company for my parents. And you got to understand something about my parents. Again, my parents, they grew up in Texas. They grew up kind of with this concept of Southern hospitality. And if you know anything about Southern hospitality and Southern cooking, is that the golden rule is that you always have to have more than enough when it comes to food. You have to have more than enough. In fact, the worst thing when it comes to the concept of Southern hospitality and Southern cooking, the worst thing you could do is have too many people and not enough food. And which of course leads to the problem, is that, my mom, she had this mindset. She had this philosophy, but how do you plan on the unexpected, right? All these, I'd bring home these friends and unexpected. And of course, I remember I used to always think that would make my dad frustrated and a little upset too. In fact, I remember one time apologizing to my dad. I'm like, sorry, I keep bringing over all my buddies, for dinner. And of course, my dad was like, what are you sorry for? I would be eating peanut butter and jelly if your friends because if your friends come over, I get way better food. And because here's the thing is that my mom, knowing this, again, the Southern hospitality, the Southern mindset, she knew that when she knew that she was planning on the unexpected, and how she planned on it was she would always make more than enough. She would always make more than enough. So my friends would come over and she'd immediately and start pulling out some stuff. So I'd show up and she'd have a dish of lasagna, and it'd be great. But then when I showed up with a couple extra friends, you would think it would throw her into this nervous breakdown, this frustration. But no, she's like, well, I guess I got some soup here. Well, you're bringing Johnny over too? Well, I got some corn. I'll pull that out too, Or you brought over Russ. Let me pull out some beans. And it was like this never ending. It was like the fish and loaves. It just kept reproducing itself in the oven. And look, I share that with you because I think God works in a very similar way when it comes to the troubles and the adversities in our lives. When opposition, when the enemy, when the adversity, when that struggle comes and takes a seat at your table, I think God does something very similar. I think, even as the enemies show up, the more enemies gather around, what does God do? He just pours out more. He just pulls out more. He brings out more out of your life. He pulls out more out of your life. He pours more into your life. When failure sits down, what does he do? Pulls out more grace. In fact, in Romans, he even says this very thing. He says, where sin abounds, grace abounds so much more. And so when failure sits down, he pours out just more grace. When struggle sits down, he pours out more perseverance. When heartache sits down, he pours out more comfort. When fear sits down, he pours out more faith. That's the kind of God that we serve. See, he's not taken back. He's not, taken by surprise when trouble comes and heartache comes. He sees it as an opportunity. In fact, that's why James, in James 1, he was able to say, I rejoice when trial comes, because I know it's producing something. God's pulling more out of me. God's pouring more into me. See, what he would see oftentimes as a trial, and a lot of us would just see as a frustration, he saw as an opportunity. He knew that the more struggle, the more opposition, the more stuff came his way, God just was going to bring out more. He was going to do more. He was going to pour out more. That's the kind of God that we serve. That's the kind of God that we have. See, God feeds me in spite of my enemies. He feeds me because of my enemies. And then this last one, and I love this one, is that God sometimes even feeds me with the help of my enemies. God sometimes feeds me even with the help of my enemies. My father-in-law, he loves watching the Food Network channel. I don't know if he still watches this show, but there for a while he was like really into the Food Network Star. And basically how this show would work was that these guys, it'd be like, about 12, 15 contestants would show up, all kind of, aspiring chefs. And they would be kind of run through all these different kind of cooking challenges. And if you made it through, if you were the lone survivor at the end, you got your own show, you got tons of money, and it seemed like a pretty great deal. And so they would go through this. And inevitably, at the end of the show, they always had this kind of big surprise, like the ultimate challenge. It would always kind of come down to two contestants, and they would have like this ultimate cook-off challenge. And the surprise was this, which really, if you were to watch any of the episodes, they always act shocked when they would like do this. But if you watch any of the previous episodes, this is how it always worked out, was that at the very end, when it was the ultimate cooking contest, mano a mano, the ultimate food challenge, what was it that they always did to throw the little wrinkle into the cooking competition? Is that they would bring back some of their former rivals. Some of the former contestants, the people that they were in a serious food fight against, they would bring them back and put them to work on each of their teams. Amen. And I love that. See, when David's in there saying, I prepare a feast in the presence of my enemies, he's not talking about, your enemies are going to kind of sit around you and there's going to come this moment where you're going to be able to look at them and say, I told you so. I told you it was going to work out, almost like you kind of get your revenge. And that's not what he's saying at all. No, what David's trying to get at is that when he's saying, I prepare a feast for you in the presence of your enemies, he's there saying, I can take all that adversity, all those obstacles. I can take that failure. I can take that fear, and I can put it to work for your good and my glory. I can make it work for you rather than against you. That's what he's getting at. In fact, a great picture of this as we kind of start to wrap up here is in Acts chapter 13, kind of getting back to Paul, of how God will sometimes can use our enemies. And let me be clear here too. It's not that he's the cause of your trouble, the cause of your heartache. It's just that he can take those ingredients, no matter how bad they are, and he can use them for your good and his glory. And so we see this. We see a great picture of this in Paul in Acts 13. I like what Luke says. He's kind of describing the situation here. In verse 49, it says, the word of the Lord spread through the whole region, but the Jewish leaders incited the God-fearing women of high standing and the leading of men in the city. They stirred up persecution against Paul and Barnabas and expelled them from their region. Basically what's going on here is Paul and Barnabas, things are going great. They're preaching the gospel. Things are happening. Lives are getting changed. Lives are getting saved. And then, which, by the way, kind of brings up a little quick side point here. How many of you know you can be doing exactly what you're called to do, what you need to do, and then still face some trouble? Still face things not going the way you planned them to or expected them to or thought they would go? And yet I love Paul and Barnabas' response. Verse 51 says, so they shook the dust off their feet. They shook the dust off their feet, and kind of brings it back to what Jesus said in Luke, where he actually talks about, hey, if you go into a community, go into a town, and they don't accept you, hey, just shake the dust off your feet. Listen, some of you need to do that tonight. Some of you, the reason you're stuck, the reason you're not experiencing really the joy right now, living in joy, not living in victory, is because you've settled in a place of bitterness. You've settled in a place of unforgiveness. You haven't shaken the dust off your feet. And part of it is because, again, you put your faith in your circumstances and not in the character of a God who says, the good work I began in you, I'm faithful to complete it. I'm faithful to take, you trust me that I can take these ingredients, I can take that heartache, I can take that failure and turn it into something for your good and my glory. And so they shake the dust off their feet. And here's what happens next. And it says that they go in verse 51, it says, they went on to this town known as Iconium, and the disciples were filled with joy and with the Holy Spirit. I love that. They go to a place called Iconium. Now again, Iconium was not what they had planned. It wasn't what they dreamed. It wasn't where Paul was wanting to go. Iconium was not on the agenda. And yet, check out what happens here. Acts 14:1. At Iconium, Paul and Barnabas went as usual into the Jewish synagogue. There they spoke so effectively that a great number of Jews and Greeks believed. In other words, revival came to Iconium. Lives got changed at so much a greater level, a greater capacity than even before. But what brought them there? What got them to this place? What got them to this place where God used them in such a powerful way? The very same enemies who were stirring up opposition, stirring up trouble. Because, again, you gotta understand, God's not, he's not causing the trouble, but he can use the trouble for your good and his glory, right? And sometimes he'll take what your enemies would seek for harm, what your enemies would seek to destroy you, the things they would try to kind of stir up, to try to stir up the bitterness inside you, to try to stir up the anger inside you, to try to stir up the frustration. And what I love about our God is that when you put your confidence, when you put your faith, not in your circumstances, not in what's happening around you, but in the character of a God, he says, listen, I'm working it for my good. I'm working it I'm working it behind the scenes. I'm creating something. I'm moving something. Listen, when your faith, when you got something that's not focused and living based on the outside circumstances, but what this relationship on the inside, what God does is he can take that same opposition, that same adversity, that same failure, and he'll use it to stir something up inside of you. He'll use it to stir up a greater call, to stir up a greater purpose, to stir up a greater mission. He can take the same thing, that same trouble, your enemy, your opposition, your struggle might have been trying to stir up to get you stuck and get you in a place where you're living in bitterness and living less than the victorious life you were created to live. He can take that and stir it up. Because, and you sit there and you think, well, why? Why that process? Because let's be honest. Some of us, if we're really honest about it, we don't pray the same way when times are going good as we do when times are tough. Like there's not that same urgency. There's not that same fervency. And if we're honest, it can be really easy for a lot of us to just kind of settle. To settle in the bitterness, to settle in the frustration, to settle for less than what God has called us to, less than what God created us for, less than the purpose he designed you for. And so he'll take and he'll allow some of that opposition to stir things up on you, not so you would get stuck, but actually just the opposite. couple weeks ago, it was my wife's birthday, and my boy had this great idea. Like, hey, let's make mommy breakfast in bed, which was a great idea until the moment he abandoned me in the kitchen and like went up there and crawled into the bed waiting for breakfast as well. And so in my mind, I thought, well, I'll create some omelets. I'll make some omelets. Well, the problem with omelets is that, I couldn't do it without it burning and starting to catch on fire. And so I thought, well, I'll just do a scramble. But even with a scramble, like, you got to keep stirring it, right? You got to keep stirring it, because if you don't stir it, what happens? It gets stuck. And that's the same way God works in our lives. You got to sometimes allow things to stir us up, not because he wants us to get stuck, but actually just the opposite, to get us unstuck, to release us, to stir up a greater call, a greater purpose, greater significance in our lives. And in fact, getting back to Paul and getting back to this letter in Philippians, we see this very same thing. In fact, in that passage at the very end where he's talking about kind of his chains, the very end of the first chapter here, I love what he says. Because something you got to understand about Paul is that Paul had this dream. Paul's dream ultimately was to go and to preach to the masses in Rome. And yet, instead of that dream seeming to come to reality, he finds himself